Hey guys, Pat Parker here with 52 Books, where we read everything from pulp to Pulitzers. And today I'm going to be bringing you a wrap-up of March and a talk about my April TBR. So a couple of little stats. We are 13 weeks into the year, and I am 23 out of 52 books for the year, so doing pretty good. We'll still have to wait until later into the year to see how well I do, because life intervenes and stuff. All right, so wrapping up March, wrapping up the first quarter of the year. During March, there were two books that I did not finish, and that was Titus Grown by Mervyn Peake and Zone 1 by Colson Whitehead. Now, I was like 800 some odd pages into Titus Grown before I gave up on it. And how does somebody get that far into a book and then DNF it? Well, I was listening to it on an audio, and the audio that I found for it for free ended before the story ended. So there was still, I don't know, a couple of hundred pages left in the book. And this particular book, the language in it lends itself very much to audio. It's a very good audio book. It's a very poor reading experience. So I was not able to complete that. The Colson Whitehead, Colson Whitehead is one of the only 4 people in history to have won the Pulitzer Prize twice. And so that puts him in leagues, in company with folks like William Faulkner and John Updike and Booth Tarkington. So, but despite the awesome skills of this author, the book that I attempted to read was Zone 1. It was a zombie book, and it was written from the point of view of this character that had post-traumatic stress disorder from having to deal with the zombies. They called it post-apocalypse stress disorder. But because his mind was all confused and jumping back and forth in time and disoriented, that's how the story was told. And so it was very confusing and disorienting and difficult to follow. So I didn't make it through Zone 1. All right, of the scheduled books, I scheduled myself to read Stormfront by Jim Butcher, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, Summer of Night by Dan Simmons, and Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. And I completed all of those. Stormfront was a quick, easy, escapist sort of read. I don't know if you've read Dresden Files, but if you haven't, it is about a wizard in modern day who is a private investigator. And so it's sort of a mashup between Harry Potter, I guess, and detective noir. And it was a fun read. Lonesome Dove, man, it was a phenomenon. It was a slow read, but I was fully engaged the whole time. Anytime that I had to set the book down to go off and do something else, even if it was a day or so later that I got to continue, it didn't take me but a paragraph or so to get right back into it. And by the end of it, my emotions were kind of wrecked because of all the death and dying and killing and all that. So I would totally recommend Lonesome Dove to anybody. Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. Now, I've said before that I've had a funny relationship with Dan Simmons books. I keep reading them and I keep hating them. I read Hyperion, which a lot of folks have said it's like the greatest science fiction ever written. And it's sort of like a version of the Canterbury Tales, except in space. These people are going somewhere and telling their tales as they travel. But it was confusing and boring to me. I also read The Terror, and that was the one about the sailing ship, the English sailing ship trapped in the ice in the Arctic Circle, and they're trying to survive the ice and all that, and some monster, something is hunting them. The Terror was terrible. It was boring and way too long. All right, I've also read Ilium by Dan Simmons. It is about the Trojan War. I'm a flunky for the Trojan War, so it should have been a fit, but this Trojan War was set on Mars, and it was at least 2 times too long and pretty boring. But for some reason I've kept coming back to Dan Simmons books, and I watched a reviewer some time back who said that Summer of Night was the greatest coming of age story they had ever read. And so that turns me on to reading yet another Dan Simmons book, and it was fantastic. It's about these kids, I don't know, 11, 12 years old, growing up in this small town. They're out of school for the summer, and something weird, creepy is happening. One of the things that I love best about this book is, at least until the halfway point, just about almost every chapter, if not every single chapter, ends with a paragraph or so about how the characters in this chapter didn't happen to see the creepy, dark thing just outside their vision doing its thing, or the characters, while they were talking, didn't see the spooky bat-shaped things flying over them. So that's one of the classic ways of keeping suspense built up, is to keep something dark and creepy right on the edge of your vision, so that when you turn your head, it's not there. And this book achieved that masterfully. I loved Summer of Night. So who knows, maybe I'll read some more Dan Simmons. All right. I also read Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. That's another coming of age. This time it is a 12-year-old boy and his 9-year-old brother. And it's a funny book because there's really no semblance of any sort of plot to it. It is basically a collection of vignettes of all the crazy people in this town and the strange situations that are going on. It takes most of the book before you see any sort of semblance of a plot. It turns out that there is a serial killer running amok in the town, in the area, and several people get killed. But one of the coolest things about Dandelion Wine, besides just the amazing language, it's an amazing, masterful literary creation, and the language is almost poetic. It's almost like reading a 200-page poem. But one of the cool things about this extended poetic language book is that it is a prequel for another of Ray Bradbury's stories. This time, Something Wicked This Way Comes. So this little sweet coming of age story with all this poetic language is at some point between the end of Dandelion Wine and the beginning of Something Wicked. The tone changes. So what has been sweet and bright and nostalgic becomes terrifying. So I'm looking forward to reading Something Wicked This Way Comes. All right, in addition to books that I have scheduled, I also frequently get done with those a little bit earlier before the month is done, and I read the rest of the month worth on a whim, just whatever I happen to want to pick up. And this month I also read White Mountains by John Christopher, 6 Days of the Condor by James Grady, and Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, White Mountains is the first book in the Tripods trilogy. You may have read it, or you may have seen it on TV. I think it was a televised series in England, but where I was first exposed to it was in Boy Scouts. When I was around 12 or so, the Boy Scout magazine, Boy's Life, serialized Tripods, the trilogy, in Boy's Life in cartoon form, so a comic strip. And that's where I first got turned on to Tripods, and eventually read the trilogy, and eventually he wrote a prequel. So it's what Douglas Adams refers to as a increasingly misnamed trilogy of 4 books. So I would totally recommend that one. It's a reread for me, and I have read it again, and we'll certainly go on to the other 3 books, and would recommend them all. 6 Days of the Condor by James Grady is a 1974-1975 era spy thriller, and they turned it into 3 Days of the Condor with Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway, which is one of my favorite old spy thrillers. And I did a video the other day about a bunch of cool things that you read about in this book that there's no such thing now. Like, I'll give you 1 or 2 and then let you go watch the video, and I'll link it right up there. So payphones and landlines constrained the story, because part of the story involves manipulating the payphones and the landlines and the telephones. Now, I think less than 30% of the American population even have a landline. So, and I can't tell you the last time that I've seen a payphone anywhere. All right. Also, Reagan National Airport. This spy story takes place in Washington, D.C. And Ronald Reagan National Airport was back then named National Airport because it was before Ronald Reagan. So this video that I linked up there will have a bunch of those little nostalgic tidbits that are sort of like top 11 ways to show that you're getting old because you remember these things. Okay. Jekyll and Hyde. This is certainly a reread. I think most folks have read or seen Jekyll and Hyde. It's been redone. It's been done as movies over and over and over again. I know that there was like a 1912 version, a 1920 version, a 1932 version, 1940 something version. There were several versions in the 2000s. It's been done as cartoons. So Jekyll and Hyde is now like cultural literacy for us. And I was thinking the other day, what I really wish for myself is that I could go back and read Jekyll and Hyde again with no knowledge of it, through the eyes of somebody in the 1800s that was reading this for the first time, somebody that was reading it soon after Robert Louis Stevenson wrote it, and it must have been crazy shocking, because it's still a fantastic story, even though, I mean, it's several hundred years old now. All right, moving on to April. What am I going to be reading in April? I don't know if I've told y'all, but the way that I build my TBRs for each month is I try to get 4 books on there. One of them is going to be a Pulitzer Prize winner, because that's sort of a goal that I have set myself, is to read through all the Pulitzers. And one of them is going to be a Hugo or Nebula Award winner, because I like science fiction and fantasy. And the other 2 are sort of up in the air, but I have been tending to pick something really old and something new. So it's like the old wedding thing, something old and something new and something borrowed in blue. I don't know what borrowed in blue. I guess I could borrow a book from somebody, but my TBRs are something old, something new, something Pulitzer, and something Hugo or Nebula. Okay. So for April, I plan to read The Way of Adan by Philip Chase, Who by Algis Budrys, Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, Beloved by Toni Morrison, and Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Okay. Way of Adan is Philip Chase's debut novel. He is a booktuber, and he's one of the big fancy names that everybody loves to watch. So check out Philip Chase on BookTube on YouTube, and then check out his new novel. I started a couple of days early, and I don't know, a couple of 100 pages into it, and it's very good. It is. I've got one tiny question or disappointment in The Way of Adan, and that is, there's this character. He's an evil priest, and his name is Bagsac, Bagsac. Well, I can't read that without thinking it says ball sack, and every single time, even though I like slow down and read it letter by letter so that I know that it's bag sack, I still think it's ball sack. So I think that's a particularly unfortunate name for Philip to have chosen for this guy, but maybe that's just my glitch. Okay. The next one, Who by Algis Budrys, is the 1958, 1959, sometime in there, Hugo Award winning novel. It is a Cold War thing, except it takes place way in the future. And the premise is that this spy, this agent, gets captured by Russia. And when he's returned, they said, well, he was so badly injured that we had to like put him back together and rebuild him, and he's got a new face and new bionic arms and that sort of thing. So when they return him, the United States is not even certain that it's the guy that they lost. So it's this big question about how much of the original guy has to remain for it to be their guy that they're getting back. So I'm looking forward to that. It sounds like a trip. Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. I have read this before a long time ago, remember very little of it, but it is a coming of age, and it is a Southern Gothic sort of horror story. So it's going to be coming of age under scary, terrible conditions. Beloved by Toni Morrison. It's a Pulitzer. I know absolutely nothing about it, but I'm going to read it. And that's my 4 for the month, but I already said that I was so turned on by Dandelion Wine this past month that I figured to add Something Wicked This Way Comes in there. Now, on my maybe read list that I might pick some whims from if I manage to read all that in the month, Haunting of House Hill by Shirley Jackson and The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I don't know a whole lot about either of those stories. I know Shirley Jackson was touted to us in school as a great author because we had to read her short story, The Lottery. And there is so much similarity between The Lottery and Hunger Games that it had to have been an influence. But I'll probably be reading Haunting of House Hill. And The Night Circus, I don't know anything about that. So, what are you going to be reading in March? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you enjoy this sort of content and want to see me fumbling my way through these things, like and subscribe so that it will show these videos to more people on the interwebs. I really appreciate it. Thank you.